So we're gonna wind down with the final thoughts of the game. I think I have seen enough to come to the conclusion of what I want to say. So I know it's been a while, at least for the people watching, but let's go back to the beginning of the game, because I feel like this game, much like Suikoden 2, was a roller coaster. I think there's actually a lot of parallels to how I felt about this game, similar to Suikoden 2. So let's start with the parallel of both of them. I feel like both of them started off pretty strong. It pulled me in. I feel like the initial conflict was interesting. The only thing I was a little off-put by, literally in 3, was when we had to select a character. I was like, oh, okay. I didn't really know who to choose, and I didn't get like a whole bunch of information. I would have rather have seen some cutscenes first and then selected them, but I'm like, okay, I'll pick a character at random when I was playing my first playthrough. And in this one, I ended up choosing Chris. And I feel like it had enough world building in it. I feel like the world building in Suikoden has been pretty solid. So you're presented with like this like stuffy council trying to boss the knights around, and you see the peace treaty gone awry. Like, that's a fairly compelling point to kind of start your story on, where you want to see where it goes. And almost immediately when you start getting control of the characters, you start to see a lot of the problems. So I think this has like an inverse of what Suikoden 2 had, where Suikoden 2 had really improved controls, graphics, arguably soundtrack over its predecessor. This one has improved story. I liked the overall story of this one a lot more than the other ones that we played. But man, oh man, did it fail really hard on the mechanics. And I feel like that really stops it from being a easy recommend game. So there are a lot of things that are detractors. If you're able to look past it, I totally get why people would play this game. I had the same statement more or less when we played Suikoden 2, so that's why I'm reminded of Suikoden 2. Suikoden 3 is very similar. This game has a huge camera problem. The camera problem is such a pain in the ass. I don't want to hear people defend that camera. The camera is atrocious. It is a fixed camera. It is almost never useful. You will often find yourself going out, let's say to the right, to go into another room, and then it angles you facing left into the transition. And it makes no sense. I hate that. I hate that so much. Please don't do that. Please don't ever do that in any modern game ever. Like, that happened in Suikoden 1 once. If you remember the stairs in the castle, it was possible to end up where, like, up, down, like if you're holding up, you'd accidentally go down the stairs while holding up because of how it positioned the character. Like, Suikoden 1 had one instance of this. Suikoden 3, this happened like 8 or 9 times. It was not a one-off thing. It was many dungeons, many rooms, even in towns. Even in towns, it, like, gave confusing directions. I think we were in a underground portion of the castle at one point, and I legitimately had no idea what direction I was going, because I was like moving forward on the screen and up on the map, and then it flipped it, so I was facing down, and also the map was facing down to proceed, without any turns of the corridor or anything. It was so jarring. I remember that. It was so jarring. I was like, what is happening? Like, I didn't take stairs. I didn't go around a corner. Why am I going backwards? What is happening? So, detractor number 1 is that. Number 2, movement in this game is so slow. Oh my gosh. If you could patch... If they're ever going to remake this game, they need to patch the movement speed. They also need to fix another annoying component, which is a subcomponent of movement speed is too slow. So you have big, wide open areas for a majority of the game with absolutely nothing to do in them. So I am really not a fan of the big empty areas. I think they were just like really full of themselves with early 3D game design. I see that all the time. It's not specific to this game. They're like, oh, you know, it's one of those things of just because you can doesn't mean you should. Where, like, we just had the most dead and boring... Like, there were some of the most dead and boring dungeons in the series. And I'll give you an easy example. I don't remember the differences between any of the grasslands we went to. They were long, empty hallways that randomly reoriented you when you went to random screens. And there's no treasures, there's no bosses there. Well, unless you fight an area boss, but we'll get to that later. There's nothing of interest. There's no hidden items. It's just walking in a very boring open land. There's not even, like, trees. Like, there are woodlands, which are also arguably just as boring, but at least it's something to find in them. But yeah, there are just time-wasting dungeons. And I feel like what really holds this game back from being another easy recommend is people have to be able to put up with how long it takes for you to go from point A to point B. And unfortunately, due to the story narrative, it will have you picking these 3 characters, and you go from point A, you go to point B, you see an event at point C, then you go to point D, then you go back to point B, then you go to point E, then you go back to point B, then you go to point A. More often than not, you almost always do kind of a... You have like 1 or 2 detours, but you ultimately go back to the point at which you came multiple times in the story. Whether it is a burned village, or your castle, or something else. And because there's no fast travel, this is the most grievous of sins. This one took a lot of enjoy. Like, I was having fun with the game until like 20 or 30 hours in, where I'm like, I'm willing to overlook a lot of things. The fast travel is not one of them. It is absolutely unacceptable how bad it is in this game. This is one of the worst cases of padding I have ever seen with dungeon travel. So like, what would normally, like, let's even keep it within the series. Let's not even compare it to other RPGs. Let's be as fair as possible. In Suikoden 1, I can go from the final area of the game to any other point in the map in 5 minutes. And I'm done. I could go to any... That includes escaping random battles. I can let go. I can go from the final castle of the game. I could go to the Rose Castle. I could go to the Dragon's Den. And that's just from walking. Suikoden 2 got worse. It makes you pad back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And I said that drove me wild in Suikoden 2. That drove me wild. This game, just going from one town to another town is like a half hour. Why? Why does it take so long to go between towns? That is like so not acceptable to me. Like, it drives me wild. It takes me out of the story. It takes me out of the gameplay. And I'm just like, I really don't want to go through this grassland that has literally nothing to do in it for like the 20th time. And it's like, oh my gosh, if I get in a battle, combine it. So now we're going to combine some things. So battles are not as fun in this game as I would say some of the other games. So like, I think it really made a big misstep of moving away from the 6-man party to just only letting you control the front 3 characters. I think that was a really big misstep. If they had kept the 6-person party and you had been able to tell like your back row to use runes and your front row to attack, I think that would have fixed a lot of my issues with the combat. Not all of them, but a lot of them. But the fact that it like completely destroys your ability to like pick teams due to this makes it like not really enjoyable. So it's like you either pick a team of all auto attackers or you get like 2 mages. Because if you play 6 mages, you're not doing any damage and you can't even get the other people to spellcast. So it's just like, it's literally not possible to pick the people you want to play with. So like, combine like all these things that make the game much longer than it has to, and then it gives you the biggest slap in the face. Biggest slap in the face. You don't get fast travel until well, first of all, if you've been collecting every character as you go along the way, we're talking like 50 hours. You are potentially playing for 50 hours before you get to fast travel, and then the game ends in 10 hours. What's the point? It's even worse than Suikoden 2. And that is like assuming you don't even really grind. This is just going to like recruiting people as soon as humanly possible. So I think also where this game fails as a Suikoden game is, again, not the plot. And it's not the runes. Although there's a lot of things we can talk about. I'm trying to narrow it down. We're going to try to stay focused. So one thing that I feel like it really fails, and I know Chad agrees with me, is that like the whole point of a Suikoden game is we're supposed to come across these wacky characters. Some are like, you know, more tropey than others, some are like more traditional, but like you have a wide range of playable characters and the chat loves it. You can play as kobolds, you can play as dogs, you can play as like robots, you can play as like anything. And I feel like where they really drop the ball in terms of like being able to put up with all this padding, the gym teacher, is that like there are characters you select that just never get a chance to use the characters you recruit. What were they thinking? Like, if you recruited a character with Godot, one of the 3 protagonists, you don't get a free character slot until chapter 3. There's only 5 chapters in the game. We got 1 free slot, I think at one point in chapter 3, and then chapter 4 was the first time we got free slots. Ridiculous. Ridiculous. What were they thinking? And it's weird because like Suikoden 2 partially solved this already. Why did we go backwards from this? Suikoden 1 had the problem of like, you know, I would say at least 70% of the game you could choose your party and 30% you were just hard locked. There was a particularly bad segment of the game where I think 5 out of 6 characters were locked, and that felt kind of bad. Suikoden 2 introduced the concept of the convoy in terms of like you can actually put characters that would normally go in your main party in the side party. The problem in Suikoden 2 is that it didn't do it consistently, and it didn't always let you do that, which was the only problem with the system, is that it didn't always use it. If it always used it, it wouldn't be a problem. Suikoden 3, the convoy system's back to how it was in Suikoden 1, where, yeah, you get, like, NPCs to join you, but, like, you can't tell them if they're, like, active combat members to not be in your party. Yeah, choose your party, Nanami will be included. Exactly. Like, sometimes in Suikoden 2, it let you put her in the convoy, even though she's required for the plot. So I'm like, this is a problem they have already solved. So I don't understand why they got rid of that in 3. That will always baffle me. Like, I would have been fine with having, like, Ace's crew, or not Ace's, Godot's crew there, and, like, you sub out a couple characters. Like, maybe you can't sub out everybody, and then that would still add to variety. Like, it wouldn't be perfect, but if you could at least sub out 1 or 2 characters every time, and, like, you had a max limit of the convoy, you could play around it. Do you know what I mean, chat? Like, it still wouldn't be perfect, but it would have helped a lot with the recruitment in this game. So I think the problem is just, like, there were so many characters that were actually somewhat interesting, and you just don't get to play with them. It's just like, what a waste. And I feel like some of the jokey kind of characters were actually, like, quasi-viable. Like, there wasn't as big of a disparity in, like, bad units to good units when it came to, like, the animal units. In fact, I think overall, the monster units were pretty much improved, like, completely compared to Suikoden 2. Like, the fact that they can use items is so huge. Right, chat? They can actually get some Jizos and stuff like that. Remember that, chat? They couldn't even use items in Suikoden 2. So, like, there were general improvements. Or I like, the mounted combat where we had, like, Fubar and Hugo. Oh, by the way, we didn't even talk about the character names. Oh my gosh, the character names. What were they thinking? But, like, you could pair up units, and that what would have been, like, the big unicorn or whatever in Suikoden 2, that was just, like, a completely useless unit, is, like, one of the best characters in the game. Like, they are just hands down, like, low resource god killing machines. Like, they are just going to wreck party, and I think they are actual legit good top tier. Like, not just like joke and like semi-viable, but like mounted characters are really good and better than just having 2 regular melee characters. Especially since you could get away with double strike, yet still be tanky, which is just absolutely absurd. So it's just like, there were some small improvements to the combat. I think I like the concept of leveling skills to make the level system a little deeper. I don't know if they hit the mark with it. I feel like I had the same kinds of issues I had in other Suikoden games where I was like, man, I really wish it would stop locking me out of tutors or a blacksmith when I really need to upgrade these characters, because I'm swapping protagonists like every 2 to 3 hours, and sometimes they just don't get access in their chapter to go to certain cities. So I just found it incredibly annoying throughout the game. The flashbacks this weekend to intensify of me being locked out randomly. Like, remember that, chat, when I went through chapter 4? Or no, when I went through chapter 5 and I made the mistake of picking Jean in Godot's chapter. Do you remember that, chat? And then we didn't have any rune shop user at all for the other characters. Like, that is so bad. What were they thinking, chat? Absolutely, what were they thinking? And you know what? Like, okay, so we're talking. You know what? No. I'm gonna go backwards yet again. I almost missed the point. That's very important. I wanna stress how not acceptable this is. So combat is already slower because you can't choose actions for all 6 characters. Movement on the overworld, the dungeons are vastly inflated. You move way too slow on the map. The camera is such an issue. So all this time you're walking around and it just takes forever. It forces you to go through dungeons to go 2 points in the overworld, which is not something that was necessarily true in Suikoden 1 and Suikoden 2. Like in Suikoden 2, sometimes you could take, for example, a forest path to go to some other path, but usually you could get like a boat or just something. There was something else you could do to just not have to go through a dungeon to go to the other area. Suikoden 3 offers no outs. There's no boat travel on the overworld. It's a simple point and click. You have to go through the dungeon every time. There are no shortcuts in the dungeon. And then, like, you get a character that can teleport you around. And that character doesn't come in until chapter 4. Again, there's only 5 chapters in the game, so it just listen to it. It's just like you're already more than 4/5 through the game. And that doesn't even include the fact that when I say chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, that every protagonist has a chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3. So you've potentially played more than 80% of the game in order to get the ability to just warp to one location. Not even the ability to warp back from said location, as denoted. The most grievous of sins is that fast travel item to go back to your castle is a missable, optional item. How dare you, Suikoden 3? How dare you? How dare you think it is okay to not give the player, when they get the fast travel, the ability to warp back to it via the plot? Why? Why then is it also locked behind you needing a very specific character in your party too in order to get it? What a terrible decision. Absolutely bad Suikoden 3. This is where you get the newspaper out and you'd bop it, because it was like that detracted so much from the game. Like, if you could cut out all of the walking filler, a lot of the combat. And also, by the way, I felt like, maybe chat would agree or disagree, that of the Suikoden games we've played so far, this game basically never allowed me to let go, ever. I, like, legit could only let go if I went back to, like, a previous chapter's dungeon. Otherwise, like, even if I beat the boss of the area, I still can't let go the enemies of the dungeon. I don't know. So couple that all together, of all this padding, of needing to walk through all these areas, then randomly, just to further annoy the player, randomly one of these encounters might actually be a super boss. Just PS, by the way, I hope you're not walking through the forest as, like, Hugo, and then you just find the Grand Holly. Like, you will legit game over. If you don't know that can happen, you will legit game over. Like, it's just like, yeah, like, oh, I know the enemies you've been fighting had 200 health. Why don't you fight something with 3,000 and there's 4 of them? Like, what? Who balanced these bosses? Like, towards the end of the game, it's less of a deal. Their power discrepancy between the normal enemy and the boss is not as big, but those first chapters were atrocious with the area bosses. Oh my gosh, they were so bad. Why? Like, that thing is even harder than, like, the story boss of the chapter. But, like, it could happen to you in, like, the first hour of playing the game. That is a pretty bad feeling, by the way. Pretty bad. If you want to piss players off, just give them an absolutely unwinnable encounter that where they go to fight it, they hear music, and they're like, okay, maybe it's a little harder. They watch themselves do like 400 of the 600 they need to do, potentially to one of the 4 tentacles that have spawned, and then they just take 150 to 200 damage and die. Like, throw your hands in the air. I will say the only thing that they did right from dungeon design, and I hope they actually do this to some extent in the other Suikoden games, is they gave you incentive to revisit some dungeons. Not the ones that are in the way between you and towns, but they gave you a reason to go back to other dungeons to fight what we just call chest bosses, or basically a boss guarding a chest that will respawn if you take all the items. I think that was actually pretty good for players that wanted to gear up every single character in their team, and it's not as tedious as just doing random encounters. It also dropped like incredibly good items. Like normally when you hear the word chest, I also want to describe this. Normally when you hear the word chest and we're talking about a game, you might think like maybe it's like one big item, or, you know, depending on the game, maybe it's a couple small items. No. Chests in this game from the dungeons are like 2.5 pages of items. And some of them are super rare. In fact, a lot of them end up being better than anything you could even buy in the stores. So I will say that is one of the few things they did right in the dungeons. Those chest bosses were mostly fun to fight, with the exception of the tri-laser beam hell god that guards the mountain path. That boss should not have been there prior to chapter 4. I'm just saying. That boss should have only been there chapter 4 and beyond. I don't know why that thing is there in chapter 2. That is so inappropriate. That boss is basically RNG if you beat it. The fact that you can fight a boss that can outspeed item usage is insane, chat. Like, that to me is just absolutely insane. It makes no sense. I will never understand it. It's not fair, chat. So anyway, let's continue a little further. So we talked a little bit about the padding. Oh my gosh, the padding. So not only do you go back and forth through the same paths a lot, then because like you're playing 3 characters, essentially like, not, I almost said asynchronously, but it's like quasi in parallel, you'll end up seeing a lot of events you already saw as other characters. And man, where is the skip cutscene button? This is like, man, if this game had come out in like 2010 or 2012, you know, like coming into like the PS3 era kinds of things, like there would have been a skip cutscene button. Nobody wants to watch like verbatim the same dialogue for 2 minutes. And I want to be very clear, dialogue in this game is really, really, really slow. Because kind of like in some video games where, well, let's give a comparison. So in like Suikoden 1 and Suikoden 2, if you hit X, you go to the next text box, and basically as fast as you can mash, you go through the dialogue. In this game, you have to wait for characters to get into certain poses before the dialogue even begins. So often you're basically forced to watch the whole cutscene anyway, because they're animated almost every line of dialogue. So you don't save like basically any time by like skipping the dialogue. So we had a very unfortunate incident. I will not give plot details in the final reviews, but I basically died at the final boss, and I had to sit through that cutscene. And not reading a single word, that cutscene we had to rewatch was over 5 minutes. I have cut that cutscene out of the YouTube upload, so be thankful, because that was obnoxious how long that took to get through. I felt like utter despair getting through those cutscenes. But that could potentially happen to you at almost any point in the game. Like, and that really hurts replayability. And as I said before, if you game over and die at any point, it just kind of saps all your will to live. Because, like, sure, you still get your experience like you would in other Suikoden games when you die, which is not very common, I will say, in games to actually keep levels when you die. But you have to sit through unskippable cutscenes. And they are just painful, painful slow. The game also does some really weird things where sometimes it just takes control away from the speed of which dialogue is played. That feels pretty bad too. In fact, we missed several lines of dialogue in our playthrough because the game just arbitrarily went and switched between auto dialogue, manual advance, auto dialogue, and then like an instant quick dialogue, and then it disappeared. I don't know. It was very weird. I've never seen a game jump so sporadically between two different methods. And it's not in like a modern equivalency would be Yakuza, where you have like the cinematic one, then you have like the in-game cutscene. Like, no. It's all in-game cutscene, and it just will randomly take control away from you. And sometimes they're not even moving as much in the automated dialogue as they are in the ones that you manually advance. I don't get it. It's very weird. It's very jarring to me. It did take me out of the story a little bit. I will say overall, I liked most of the characters. I wasn't a huge fan of a few of the supporting characters. Unfortunately, we still have our Nanami equivalent where I basically want to gouge my eyes out and die listening to these characters. I think chat can pretty much agree with me. Lily was one of the worst characters in the game. She dragged down Hugo's chapters immensely so. Holy, was she a terrible character. We had some really questionable recruit characters. Like, in this game, they actually do a decent job of giving you, like, introductions to the characters. I don't think it makes a lot of sense why most of them join you compared to other Suikoden games. It is just kind of random. It's just, because in this game, you don't even really get to recruit people, quote unquote, officially until you get to some people's chapters 3s. Sometimes as early as chapter 1 or chapter 2, depending on the character. And that's kind of odd. Speaking of which, I like that they took a little bit of a gamble with offering more than just the 3 protagonists to play as. I think chat generally liked the Thomas chapters, even though they were kind of like a drain to get through some of the plot. Just because that was like one of the only times in the game we were allowed to pick our own party, basically. And it's super unfortunate we didn't do the recruiting with that character, because they had basically almost nothing but free slots throughout their chapters, which was super, super unfortunate. Oh, chat, we almost forgot the most important time waster, other than the unskippable cutscenes, the long walks, the open dungeons, the inability to fast warp, the slower combat, the fact that you have to watch them move around in combat now instead of just going back to a static location in the 2D combat, or any of the other plethora of issues. The lottery. Chat, we have to talk about the lottery. Man, oh man, the lottery is something else. I think I know what they were going for. I would have hated it a whole lot less if lottery tickets did not take up an item slot and were just in their own tab. Why did they not take up their own tab? Why do you have to hold potentially 10 items in your inventory when item space is already limited in these kinds of games? Chat, why did they do that to us? And speaking of which, remember, chat, when we had the store bank and we were playing as the solo characters? And they gave us, like, what, 3 pages or something ridiculous of extra space? And I was like, wow, I hit the cap already? How is that possible? And then they just decided in chapter 4 to go like, oh yeah, you'll have like 50 pages. And I'm like, where was this earlier? It just felt so arbitrary. Do you know what I mean, chat? Like, I feel like they should have given 10 plus pages per character, and then overall should have added another 10 on top of that. But like, we very much got to the point where we had a lot of items again, unfortunately also in this game, where we couldn't quite get rid of them. Like, we had a lot of recipes, a lot of medals, we had scripts, we had antiques, we had all sorts of things we either couldn't identify or we didn't have the people for it, and it was very easy to cap up. Especially now, combine that with the chest bosses dropping 2+ pages of items, and these items are good. And again, keep in mind, normally you would just upgrade on the spot, but due to how the game works, the characters you recruited on one person can only be played with that person. And often it doesn't give you the means to transfer your items to that character because they're not technically in your party, and the characters are technically not integrated yet, and you cannot technically swap between all of your characters. And it ended up being kind of a mess, and it was kind of unfortunate. As I do think there were some highlights of the game. I think Lady Chris was one of the best characters overall. I think picking her as the protagonist was the right choice. I think Godot's team had the most personality, and they were probably the most interesting to watch. because you weren't always sure what they were gonna do, and they were like somewhat goofy, somewhat slapsticky. But I mean, like, they actually felt like a real RPG party. Like if you were playing any other game, they would have been the main characters, kinds of things. And I feel like, you know, you get to Thomas, who's kind of like a free reign character. You could pick your own party, and that's fun, sort of, depending on how you recruited people. And then you get to Hugo. Hugo. Ooh. Lily is just insufferable. Man, that is just, ugh. Her servants are annoying. She is awful. Both of her servants are super bad in combat. So you just feel like you have an extremely weak party. Fortunately, you at least have your flying griffin with you so that you have any chance to beat any boss with that team. Ridiculous. Anyway, chat, we're going to start filing our thoughts down. What things have I not mentioned so far that we could rant about? We talked about these different pathways. We talked about the story repeating itself. I guess it is an extension to that. You don't technically recruit 108 characters in the main story. You only have to recruit 104. And that's a little weird. I don't like that, to be honest. And then they give you a bonus chapter. Chat can agree, that was one of the worst chapters in the entire game. Not worth it. If that is your quote-unquote reward for getting all 108 stars, I'm gonna give that a big F. The bonus chapter where it was literally, hey, remember when this happened? What if we just add 2 lines of dialogue at the beginning and call it unique? Oh, P.S. by the way, you can't skip any of the cutscenes still, so enjoy the hour-and-a-half forced cutscenes. Like, it was so bad. It was so bad. Bad. Just watch literally the final cutscene of the bonus chapter. That's the only relevant new information. You don't learn anything new. You already are, like, plot dumped their motivations in the story itself at the final chapter. I don't really get anything new from any of those characters. In fact, if anything, it made the story worse. Like their use of illusions, like the anger illusion one was pretty BS. I think that took away from any kind of gray moral territory of some of the characters. I will not go into more details, but yeah, I did not appreciate that detail in the plot whatsoever. Trying to think anything else, Chad. I guess in terms of combat, I will say there are some minor improvements. We can't completely bash the combat. I will say for things like unite attacks, they try to penalize them by making them a little slower. Spells are also slower unless you level up skills to be better at them. Which, to be fair, if you don't do that, it just becomes rune supremacy of the game. So they tried to balance it. And I do feel like there was some melee characters that definitely outdamaged spells. There were scenarios where spells didn't do a lot of damage and melee was useful. So it kind of worked. What I do appreciate though is if you retreat or you do a unite attack and it hasn't gone off yet, the person that is not initiating is able to defend. And that makes them a lot better than they were in the other games. Even if the ratios aren't there, even if the damage isn't quite as ridiculously high due to multipliers, I think it helps just a whole lot, chat, that they are able to defend and actually survive. And defend working on spells, I think, as well, we were observing, definitely helps with some of that. Rune magic. Well, I guess if I had to give my overall feelings towards magic, as we saw in the bonus chapter, there is one rune that looks absolutely ridiculously broken. I don't know what they were thinking. It's clearly better than every rune in the game, and you could get it even outside the bonus chapter. The Pale Gate rune. It's dumb. Why does the level 1 spell insta-kill entire groups of enemies? Why? It doesn't even do low damage on top of it? Like, what were they thinking? I will say they overly nerfed the Wind rune. The Wind rune felt like one of the worst runes in the game. I would legit never take it again if I were to play this game again. Water rune, we skipped it. In theory, it would probably help you with a couple boss battles, like specifically the final boss battle. Otherwise, it just feels too slow to be useful. Like, in every other scenario, we killed a boss in 2 turns or less. So, like, it didn't really matter. So, combat difficulty is not the game's best strength. Like, overall, it is more challenging than Suikoden 2 on the whole, or some of the other predecessors. And some of the bosses do take more than 2 turns. Even with, like, optimal setups. Just because of the sheer fact that there's just too many targets. Oh, I guess that's not true. I guess if you're purely optimal, maybe it's still only 2 turns. But if you're mostly good, you're abusing thunder runes, lightning runes, maybe some fire runes, it's still going to take several turns to kill certain bosses just because there's so many targets. And I think their thing where they make your spell damage split between targets was a good way to balance some of the things. I think overall, Lightning was still probably like the 2nd best rune in the game to Pale Gate Rune. Pale Gate Rune, literally, that level 1 spell makes no sense. There's no reason not to use it over every other choice in random encounters. And we even saw that it worked on some bosses, especially in the bonus chapter. So we killed 6 enemies with something that should only do 100 damage. Like, that was just absolute silliness and broken. Other than that, there were a lot of issues either in translation or they fudged something up where, like, there were neat ideas for some runes, but they just didn't work well. A great example would be the Junglar rune, which is unique to this game, where instead of actually expending spell slots, which is normally a very key resource in Suikoden to basically not burn those until you're at a hard fight, it lets you just do like a basic buff as long as you keep chanting, and it doesn't cost any slots. The problem is that, like, there are skills associated with it, but they gave it to characters that can't use it. So that seems like a big oops and should have very easily been caught in testing. I don't know how that got through playtesting. It's like, hey, do you want to increase your ability to sustain the song or the song effects? Oops, you can't use it. And hope you didn't put any points in those skills you get. Wow. Big wow, chat. That was pretty silly. I'm sure chat would fully agree with me on that one. Oh, man. So, boy, oh boy, oh boy. When it comes to getting some of the hammers and some of the basic crafting services, I feel like the game gave most of the stores in the castle out at a reasonable rate, with the exception of Appraise. Appraise, we didn't get it until Chapter 3, and that is a long time to go in the game. Like, if you're going for, like, what we were doing, that was, like, 30 hours plus before we got one Appraise person. That was kind of, like, not necessary. I just hope in future Suikoden games, core stores should not be, like, mid-game, late-game only. Like, they don't have to be unlocked by default. We should have to earn them a little bit, but, like, come on. Come on with the appraisal. Like, we missed our opportunity, I think, in Chapter 3. And had to wait till Chapter 4, which felt super bad for how long in the game that is to get to. I don't know, chat. It's very, very questionable. Oh boy, oh boy, oh boy. I'm just making sure I don't forget anything and feel regret. Sometimes I feel that after we go through these final thoughts, because there's just so much to talk about, and then you forget because you rant before it, whether or not you put it in the actual final thoughts or not. When it comes to the villains, I will say the villains, kind of lame, chat. They interact with the plot, but they're just not really all that interesting, to be honest. I don't know. I don't feel like the main villain of it really pulled me in. We've seen worse villains on stream, but I like the idea of the villain. It's just more of an issue with the execution. Just some of the lines were just super, like, funny, terrible. Like, I think a line from the bonus chapter at one point was like, if you're gonna kill 1 million people, I'll be right beside you. And I'm like, am I supposed to find that funny or just, like, weirdly disturbing? Like, what is my takeaway supposed to be for some of the dialogue? Oh, one thing we also need to point out in the dialogue, if you bring monster companions in to replace the party members, the game makes no sense. We accidentally broke the final cutscene of the game, and the game gave us an option and the monster spoke the question, and no one translated what the monster said, so just be wary. Monsters can mess up dialogue. Kind of awful. I will say there was less going to our bed and sleeping in it outside of Thomas chapters. So that was kind of nice. I do feel like, oh, you know what? I'm forgetting one of the other major components of the game. So we talked about the plot, talked about battles. The war battles. I feel like this was a step in the right direction, but I didn't like them. The intent behind it in this particular one is that you will have units on the battlefield. Units are comprised of the 108 stars and or guest characters. And you will form squads of, I think, 5, if I'm not mistaken, and get a support character as your 6th person. I don't think you get a full 3v. I don't think you get a full 6-man in those. The problem with that is that it takes away your ability to control them. And that feels kind of bad. I know they wanted to distinguish it from normal combat, and I understand what they were going for. I just don't think it worked. Often you would have really dumb stuff. Like if you had a person with runes, they would sometimes be automatically assigned as the leader, and then they would automatically also try casting spells, and every enemy will make a beeline towards them. And this is new to Suikoden 3, we didn't talk about this until now, but if you get struck while you're casting, your magic is canceled. And so because cast time is more important in this game, and in fact it's generally slower until you get more skill points compared to the other games, this will often just lead to characters casting and instantly dying and not doing anything on their turn, which feels so bad. And I think this kind of comes back into, like, anytime I start complaining about a game, it's going to come back to the same thing I talk about over and over and over again. I do not like it when a game takes away player agency. I want to feel like I am in control. I want to feel like I'm making the right decisions. And if I lose, it's my fault. I didn't do something strategically well. I didn't prep properly. I didn't read into the scenario correctly. I want to feel like when I beat the battle, it was because I was doing something at the best of my ability instead of fighting against some of the really awful mechanics. So to give you an example of this, randomly in the war battles, enemies will crit you. It's a thing that can happen in most RPGs. Unlike other scenarios, you cannot force your party to heal. You cannot force your party to do support magic. You cannot force your party to use shield rune to berserk your people. You cannot tell your people to not use their awful garbage personal runes that do no damage when they need to just focus on a target and kill a low health target so that they do not get swarmed with 4 attacks and instead only get hit by 2 because they just focus on 2 people out of the 5 potential targets instead of all 5. And moments like that end up dragging down the game significantly because it's just like, you're like, I know what I want the game to do, but your only options are attack, flee, or defend, and if you flee, you potentially just get attacked anyway and die. So it just feels bad. I will say one other thing I mentioned, or didn't quite mention, that I do think was interesting, and I do hope this mechanic goes through in future games. I don't know if it'll be in 4 and 5, but we had the idea of the support character. So normally in a Suikoden 1 and a Suikoden 2, you had 6 combat characters, done. In this game, you actually have a 7-person party. The 7th person goes in and does something like automatic healing after battle. Maybe they cure status ailments. Maybe they allow you to access certain shops. Maybe they convert excess items into money. And they all have, well, not all, most of them have interesting abilities. Obviously, some are better than others, in particular if you're just looking to rush through the game. But it's a nice feeling that the characters that are not playable in this game, that are not also merchants, are able to do things. So for example, we had Tuda the doctor basically sustaining our party through one of the more insane and semi-unfair battles. I think chat would agree. Remember the Godot Mines fights, plural, chat? Remember that? Wasn't that like an hour plus of combat? I am so glad I grabbed the doctor for that. You have no idea, chat. Could you imagine if I didn't get healed between those battles? Because you weren't allowed to menu or do anything else in certain scenarios, and that being one of them was quite terrible. So thank you, Tuda. Yeah, we got through the gauntlet. That was like actual insanity. I was like, thankfully we had a real team, and I didn't use all my best spells, and I could get healing between. Enemies in this game, I think, are generally more dangerous than some of the other games, with the exception of Suikoden 2 Hawkmen, who are the most powerful beings known to man. Doesn't matter what your level is, get wrecked. But when it comes to just general combat, most of these enemies tend to have AoEs or some kind of status ailment effect. And generally speaking, they actually are like a little more complicated. Like, you can try to block them from reaching your people by going into pairs. As I said, you can only control 3 people at the front at a time, 1 in the front, 1 in the back. So you can kind of play around it a bit. It also has the side effect where your back row ends up getting absolutely mollywopped compared to the other games, because I feel like more often than not, like, the first attack will never go to the back row, but after that, every turn thereafter, they're always going after the back row. So it does make combat feel a little weird at first. I'm not going to say it was like a game breaker or like a complete deterrent for me, but I had to keep that in mind when we were forming a lot of teams. Like, we actually legitimately needed to gear up the back row, because more often than not, they just took all the attack detention at some point. So let's see, chat. Side activities, we mostly ignored them in this game. Unfortunately, this game kind of broke my goodwill after the bonus chapter. It was way too long for what it was. Way too long. I guess I will say the camera kind of ruined the castle. Like, there wasn't inherently anything wrong with the castle design in this game, and we had a lot of complaints about the castle design in Suikoden 2. Oh my gosh. Suikoden 3 was a little better. The elevator actually was like a serviceable shortcut. Most of the stores were all in a very obvious place, so it wasn't like really hard to find them. There weren't as many random hidden events in the castle, so you didn't have to worry about like just arbitrarily not entering a certain room after a certain period of time. I think the castle was okay. It did actually feel like a castle, but also was in a way that it still operated like an actual RPG hub, rather than just like, oh, they're just in some random room in this corner, and then you have to go to the other end of the castle for that one, you have to go to the other end of the castle, that one, the other end of the castle. I feel like that was okay. Chat liked Irk in Danger. We had like some minor letters from the mailbox every now and then. I feel like that was like enough flavor for the game. I feel like, you know, some of that stuff was interesting. But again, like, I don't see myself ever replaying this game ultimately at the end of the day. There's just too much padding. I think if I were to replay this game, I would have to play it in some kind of emulator with 4 times speed. Like, I'm dead serious. Like, it just like, I do not ever want to walk through those dungeons again at how long it took. Just because, like, just the walking alone was like 10 minutes sometimes. And we often had to go through that, like, same grassy plain upwards of 3 times or 4 times in the plot in order to proceed, let alone if we're checking out side areas. Yeah, a lot of the problems with the Suikoden 3 designs have to deal with the camera. Like, the castle has, like, save points you can't even see due to the camera, and they let you place objects around the castle, which sounds cool, but you could basically never see them because the camera's terrible. So, good job, game, on that one. 10 out of 10. But I think overall, chat, I think we covered everything. I'm failing to think if I missed anything. I think we covered combat in particular. Yeah, there's so many things where if somebody were to actually legit hack this game and remove, so like if you could even just go in the overworld after you visit a location and skip having to go in the dungeon and just go right to the next plot point, that would have, no joke, shaved off more than 10 hours of our gameplay. Minimum. 10 hours minimum from our gameplay, if not more. Like, there's so many things where if they just spent time to think about how the player would feel doing it, this game could have been like a 10 out of 10. But I just, like, as is, it's like a 6-ish. It's like, it's a little above average. Like, it had my interest at points. I did have some fun in the combat. but I'm like not really dying to play through it again due to the overall game feel. And it's not like necessarily a problem with the plot. There is a problem with repeating events and stuff in the plot. That was pretty unfun to sit through. Not being able to skip cutscenes, like there's just a lot of modern quality of life changes, but even back then, there was just certain things that they should not have done, and it just did not make sense to do. So I hope they learn somewhere between Suikoden 4, Suikoden 5, and Suikoden Tactics that they learn that players do not want to sit through some of these things, and they really tighten it down. Skipping having to walk through areas you already been to would have been a massive improvement. Did VP2 do that? Yes, that's what VP2 did. Exactly. Exactly. Like, I don't mind the game forcing me to go into it. Or if there's a story event, if it forces me to go into it for the story event, I'm also okay with that. Like, you can't just go straight to a town because there's, like, the forest in between. I'm okay with that. I'm okay with it. I don't need fast travel 100% of the time, but it's like, man, I just really am tired of going through the grass plains over and over and over again. Just, man. There's not really any overworld mechanics that I would ever really want to see in the game again. It was very basic. You know, there's not like special abilities you had in the overworld, just like your basic mini-map stuff. Just, it's very early 3D RPG. It's just what it kind of reminds me of in general. I think that's where that obsession with the big empty dungeon, because it looks cool, even though it serves no purpose and is a big waste of time and is very annoying to anybody actually playing the game. Just, I don't know, chat. I don't know. So I guess I will leave it to chat for their final thoughts. I will discuss in general. I do think the music of this game is actually fairly solid. I don't know if any of these songs are songs I will listen to outside of the game, but I think they invoked enough of a mood. I think like some of the Village music was probably some of the stronger soundtrack albums, in particular like the Duck Village. I think it was like a pretty good song. But again, like they're not quite to the level where I would want to listen to it again. Like there's not really a battle theme where I'm like, wow, I got really pumped. I'm just kind of like, it's a battle theme. Which unfortunately, that when I listen to music, that's what I go for. So it didn't like knock me out. It was fine. It didn't like grate my ears or anything, but it was just, to me, it's like, it's only somewhat memorable because it uses some motifs from the other Suikoden games. And that's the only reason it would be memorable for me. And even then, I would probably still confuse it with the other Suikoden battle themes. Yeah, it's just like, I just hope that, you know, if another takeaway, I guess, with the dungeon design is that when it does come to non-optional dungeons, I wish there were more actual treasures. They have this idea of repeatable treasures, like one-offs from like the dead bodies, pickable herbs for money and or medicine. And I think those are fine, but I think ultimately there should be some one-shot items that are like actually really good. Do you know what I mean, chat? Like in normal dungeons, not the optional dungeons, but the normal dungeons. Like we never really end up getting like crazy gear as we went along. You know what I mean? Like we just kind of, we had to keep buying stuff for the most part. So chat saying there wasn't anything stand out to me about Suikoden 3 outside of Right Gadgets, the Unite attack. That was the best Unite attack of the game, other than maybe Dog Wheel. I will state though, chat, I'm sad we didn't clip Dog Wheel. I'm gonna wave my finger at chat. Nobody clipped Dog Wheel for the first time, so it's gone forever. Rest in peace, Dog Wheel. A lot of characters were pretty forgettable. The comp was kind of bland, wasted potential, very middle of the road. Yeah, it's just like, I'm gonna blame chat on that one. Hey, I was streaming. I can't clip midstream. A lot of characters were pretty forgettable. I think I mostly agree with that, and I think the problem with that is not necessarily because the characters weren't interesting. It's just that we didn't get to play with them. And I think that just kind of, as I said before, it goes against what the spirit of Suikoden should have been. Like, chat would have remembered, like, Bell a lot better, or maybe Bracky a lot more, if we could just always use them. Do you know what I mean, chat? Like, there were some definitely oddball characters in there. Obviously, the gym teacher is in there as well. But, I mean, like, there were definitely, like, wacky game design kind of characters. But yeah, it just kind of squandered it. It just, it's a little unfortunate. Villains dragged down the plot a little bit. Just, it was fine. I don't regret playing it through. I only regret how much time we spent in dungeons. So I don't think this will be like a regret play, but I'm definitely at the point where I'm like, I'm ready to move on. Yeah, I'm just hoping if we go into later Suikoden games, they actually let us play with the characters we recruit, aka player agency. Like, I want to be able to use the things you give me. Do you know what I mean, chat? Like, is that too much to ask, that if you give the player something, they should be allowed to use it? I'm just saying, chat. But anyway, I guess in general, I mean, like, I'm not gonna rag on the graphics. We already talked before. It's very early 3D. It's not memorable with with like the looks and feel of the characters. Funny enough, I think Chad agrees with me. When Lady Chris was in her armor versus her travel suit, we're all like, go back to the armor. we're like, no. Go back to the armor. It was so much better. We're like, no. Don't wear this other thing. Get out of here. I think that's all I really have to say, Chad. I can't think of anything that we missed. You know, there's a lot of hit or miss characters even in the story. Just it's okay. I think it was a nice touch to add a little profile information in the status, so we got a little more background for the characters. We learned about the fortune teller's bad luck, for example, where his fortunes don't come true most of the time, apparently. So he's apparently just garbage at his job, as we learned. But yeah, it's a very questionable mix of things. I feel like there are enough characters for people to latch onto, whether they want to play as the child units, or the animals, or the monsters, or the mages, or the warriors. I feel like it was a pretty good diverse cast in that sense, that people could kind of play somewhat the way they wanted to, with the unfortunate hampering that until you're in Chapter 5, you don't really get to enjoy the game with all your characters, which kind of sucks. Yeah, chat, I can't think of anything else to really say. Oh, actually, one more thing. When it comes to recruiting the characters, unfortunately, you can't just recruit characters when you see them as certain characters. It seems to lock it based off of what character chapter you're in. So, like, if I'm in Chapter 1 of Hugo, I can't recruit people until his Chapter 3. Godot, I don't think he get anybody... Well, he get people in Chapter 1, but you have to visit the location first. Then Lady Chris can't get anybody till her Chapter 2, I think. And it's a little awkward, as I said before, because it's like, you gotta factor in how not fun it was, or how little payoff there was for the recruits, just to really emphasize this point, that not only do you have to like travel around all over the place multiple times, but even if you go there with said characters, you might not have the requirements needed to bring them. And because of like how long it takes to go back to the castle when you eventually get it, it just feels like such a chore. And I'm glad chat brought up Nadir, because that's where I'm leaning, chat. I'm leaning to Nadir. That, I think, is one of the worst characters to recruit in the game. Not because of how unfair it was in terms of like how to recruit them. I'm looking at you, random person that joins you in the forest, or having to go back to the mountain pass with our teleport character in order to get the other teleport character. We're not even looking at either of those characters, but man, oh man, when you do not have the, what was it, 2 men, 2 women, or 3 men, 2 women, and a child, if you don't have that formation and you mess up by even one character, you have lost an hour and a half of movement between the castle and the place that he is in. And that feels so bad. What is your payoff? Scripts. I don't know, chat. If I'm in a really good mood, we'll go back and do the scripts. I don't think they're going to factor into my review at all. As I said before, I feel like I've seen enough of the game to have an opinion on it. And I said before, I'm not going to rate it on the side content predominantly. Like, we didn't even talk about mini games in this review. They exist. I still don't enjoy them. I still don't want to do them. I will state, though, they at least tried to make it something other than card games and fishing stuff in this game. They introduced horse racing. Remember that really lackluster minigame, chat? Remember that? I'm sure chat is like, oh, right, that's a thing. And I'm like, yeah, that was the thing that happened. It was very boring. I think we won without jumping on the hardest track when you're supposed to jump over obstacles. So it's a thing you can do, I guess. If you just really want to ride in a circle for some reason for 3 laps. We'll see though, chat. So I don't think I have anything else to say in regards to this game. I'm sure this rant was super long. I'm sure it is going on an hour, if not more. I tried to skim it down, chat. I know you forgot horse racing was a thing. There's a lot you could potentially talk about in our final thoughts of the game. I mean, this game was the longest by far, and not because of content. This was like a 70+ hour game, and 40 hours of it was walking, and it was just obnoxious. It was obnoxious. The game had no right to be that long, and it makes me not want to play it again. Like, the story itself, like, maybe 12 hours. Getting through the dungeons, like, maybe 10 hours. The backtracking and the overall travel, 40 hours. Just, it's atrocious. It's so bad. It's so bad if you're getting all 108 characters. Oh my gosh. Oh boy. I will say that, okay, one final thing. The non-108 characters. There are non-108 characters in this game. They're all dogs. They're kind of hard to find without a guide. I mean, at least they're not required, so there's that. They're not as ludicrous to stumble across as the squirrels were in 2. And I do feel like the payoff was better than the Squirrel Squad, I will say. I actually genuinely thought their Unite attack was good on anything that was not the final boss. I think it was actually legit. I actually think their Unite attack could have beaten every boss in the game. That is not the final boss, because the final boss has too many parts. Otherwise, it would have been like, oh, hi, Dark Knight. How are you going to be? Oh, look at that. You parry everybody? Sure, it would be a shame if my Unite attack ignored your evade score. Oh yeah, you can still like the squirrels more than the dogs. I would just say from a like actual practical standpoint, their Unite attack could legit kill like every boss in the game. It's pretty ridiculous. I guess one thing I didn't mention, this will be our true final thought. We talked a little bit about skills affecting cast speed, some damage. It also affects accuracy and number of swings. I think I'm on the fence about it. I like the idea of as you level, you get more attacks more consistently. I like that a little better than this just plain speed mechanic of Suikoden 2. I don't know if I like fully how it was implemented, but I think, for example, I think chat would agree, it was really neat seeing your characters go from 1 swing to 2 to 3 gradually as you went through the game. Or in the case of Emily, what was it, 10 swings? Just go into 10 swings. Just do whatever you want. Or like the continual attack. I think that actually felt pretty good. I like some of the support skills in the game to make melee not necessarily damage focused, but actually utility focused. Like freeze. Freeze was like one of the best skills in the game. Chat remembers that. It randomly stunned. So we had like a support archer that could AoE heal, berserk, or if somebody else was casting and they were supporting, they could just potentially lock down an enemy by themselves with the stun. So I do like that characters felt like they did more in combat in general. I don't know if it was like, again, it felt like an experiment. It needed more refinement. If the next game was like this, but they just improved it, I wouldn't like be mad at the game. It wouldn't stop me from getting the game. I'd actually be interested if the next game is like that. I don't know. But you know, there were some interesting ideas in there for sure. Oh yeah, Emily was just like, yeah, my attack turn is all of them. So I like that there was kind of that balancing mechanic to feel like scaling damage. And I like that it gave a purpose to like it. One other thing I will state as well in regard to the combat is that the game makes it very easy to bring characters that are low level up to a high level, because the game has like an average level it expects you to be at in a dungeon. Once you start hitting that, you get less XP. But if a character is overwhelmingly underleveled, just like one battle could be somewhere between like 3 and 9 levels, depending on how many enemies there are. And I think that was actually a really great mechanic. I hope that continues throughout the whole series. That actually encourages you, if you swap out, to not feel like you're horribly behind. Now, this game does encourage you to keep playing characters for a while, because if you accrue skill points aside from XP, by just doing combat. So it kind of went a little contrary to itself. So if they end up removing the skill system in future games, I understand why. But I think the skill system overall was somewhat interesting. I think there were characters that should have had more free slots than they did. So that way you could go to the tutors and give them, for example, something that makes them tankier with armor protect, or give them magic resistance, because the majority of the bosses in the game end up using spells by the end. And I like that there was like the equivalency of like a finesse user. We didn't really have that per se in the earlier games. Like sometimes we had characters with decent dodge, but they didn't make great tanks. But we had characters like Augustin, who's able to not only just parry basically all physical attacks, but then that also gives them increased number of counterattacks. And I actually really like that system of the repel. Like, characters did counterattack in the other games, but I don't think it was as controllable or as like buffable as it was in this game. Because at one point we had our like party tank literally parry an entire group of enemies, and they got like 6+ attacks. And we had more control over who was targeted because we had things like Firefly or other things of that nature. And now the true final point. I think, chat, we can all say worst rune in the game goes to Wall. Wall stops you from attacking, using unite attacks, using spells. Why? Why, chat? Why is that in the game? Why would you just get rid of your character? Don't do that, chat. Don't do that. So anyway, chat, those are my final thoughts. We have heard the chat's final thoughts. I think it is time to conclude the stream. I think we are done with Suikoden 3 for now, but maybe chat can persuade me in the future to go back to the scripts. But for me, I am done. I do not want to see anything for quite some time. And I'm more than willing to move on to the next Suikoden game. I think after this, I'm going to need yet another palate cleanser, because I have to get remotivated. That final chapter was really bad. By final chapter, I meant the bonus chapter. And the final chapter itself was also kind of frustrating, to be honest with you. If those two things did not happen, I would have probably more things to say in praise. But I feel like overall, that mood coming from those kind of helped shape and inform people what they probably should hear. But anyway, let's give a sign off to YouTube chat. If they sat through that ramble, power to them. But if you liked what you saw, I will say, unfortunately, unless you see another video in the playlist labeled as extra, we're probably not going to touch Suikoden 3 again. We are definitely never doing another playthrough of this game again. But we'll probably be moving on to Suikoden 4 and presumably Tactics. But for now, so long, YouTube. Thank you for watching. Hope to see you next game.